Okay, Tumtum and Nutmeg time. Oh my goodness. Aunt Ivy is about to show up. Here's Aunt Ivy. I'm not a fan of Aunt Ivy. Let's see if you are. Okay, chapter 4. Arthur and Lucy had been dreading their long winter vacation at home, but it was turning out to be more exciting than they could have ever imagined. Nutmeg visited almost every night, and when they woke up to find her funny little presents under their pillows, it felt just like Christmas, even though Christmas had happened several weeks ago, and they hadn't had nearly so many presents then as they were getting now. But just at the point at which they felt things could hardly get any nicer, something horrible happened. One morning, while the Mildews were all sitting down to breakfast of canned rice pudding, they heard a car stopping outside in the lane, and then there was the sound of someone cursing, followed by a sharp rap on the front door. I wonder who that could be, said Mr. Mildew anxiously. He always felt unsettled by visitors, even the postman, and as he said it, the rapping started up again, cross and impatient. His children followed him into the hall, and when he opened the door, their hearts sank. For there was Aunt Ivy, and a taxi driver was trailing up the path behind her, carrying 5 suitcases. Your doorbell's not working, Walter, she said sourly, pushing past Mr. Mildew into the hall and ignoring the children entirely. Then she went into the kitchen, flung her gloves down on the table, and said something disparaging about the mess. If you say something disparaging, you're saying something not very nice about it. If you give a disparaging remark, you're kind of being a little rude. Okay. Aunt Ivy lived a long way away in a big city in Scotland, and yet somehow the Mildews always saw more of her than they would have liked. She had been married to Mr. Mildew's brother, Hugh, who had run away to Africa several years ago and had never been heard from since. The children thought that if they had been married to Aunt Ivy, they would have run off to Africa too, for there was something distinctly off-putting about her. She was tall and spiky looking, with long elasticy arms and dark menacing eyes. If you have menacing eyes, they're kind of. Since losing Hugh, she had started spending Christmas at Rose Cottage, and she ruined it every time. She always snapped and snarled and gobbled all the chocolates, and her presents got meaner every year. Last time, she'd given Arthur a ping pong ball and Lucy a packet of plastic clothespins. She also had revolting habits, such as clipping her fingernails at the kitchen table and stubbing out her cigarettes in the children's boots. I have a text-to-text connection with Aunt Ivy's gifts and the gifts that the Dursleys give to Harry Potter. If you've read any of the Harry Potter books, the Dursleys don't give very nice gifts to Harry. Mr. Mildew had her to stay each year because of something called family duty, which makes people put up with all sorts of awkward things at Christmas time. But it wasn't Christmas now, it was January, and they were all very surprised to see her again. Arthur and Lucy stood at the kitchen door looking at her in dismay. Now, do remind me, Ivy, should we have been expecting you? Mr. Mildew asked, shifting uncomfortably from one foot to the other. Aunt Ivy looked at him contemptuously. Are you going senile, Walter? We arranged everything on the telephone only last week. Mr. Mildew acknowledged that this was possible, for the one thing he never forgot was his own forgetfulness. Yes, Ivy, of course, but do just remind— Mice, Walter, she said, drumming her fingers irritably on the kitchen table. At last, Mr. Mildew's memory jogged into action. Aunt Ivy had seen not one but 2 mice in her sitting room in Scotland. A sitting room is like a living room. Okay? And the sight had so upset her nerves that she had asked to stay at Rose Cottage while a pest control company took up all the floorboards trying to find them. And he had said yes just to get her off the phone. Of course. And I've forgotten how long you might stay, Mr. Mildew said, trying to sound more casual than he felt. As long as it takes, Walter, she said defiantly. I've told pest persecutors to turn my house upside down until they find those revolting little creatures. If there's one thing I loathe more than anything, it's mice. Here's the little break. Oops. So we're going to shift in time or location. Aunt Ivy and her 5 suitcases took over the living room. The sofa was turned into a bed, and an entire shelf of the bookcase was cleared to make way for all of her makeup and hair dye. Aunt Ivy took a good deal of care over her appearance. She painted her lips red and her eyelids green, and she dyed her hair jet black and parted it in a zigzag. She looked quite sinister. Sinister makes me think of like Walt Disney, like the evil people in Walt Disney, like Cruella de Vil in 101 Dalmatians. She's kind of sinister, kind of evil. And she didn't do any of the things that ants normally do. She never knitted sweaters, baked cakes, or listened to cheerful music on the radio. She just sat in the kitchen all day long, filing her nails and looking grim. Give a grim look. How would you look if you were grim? Kind of. Maybe like that. In order to avoid her, the children spent more and more time in the attic, and Mr. Mildew spent even more time than he usually did locked away in his room. The Nutmouses went to ground too because the very sight of Aunt Ivy made them shudder. If you shudder, you... When she was last here, Nutmeg had seen her standing at the kitchen windowsill, squishing a fly with the tip of her eyeliner, and Tumtum had seen her pouring boiling water on a beetle. He had once heard her telling Mr. Mildew how much she hated mice, and he dreaded to think what she'd do if she ever set eyes on them. So he was determined to make sure she didn't. That morning, when he heard Aunt Ivy's voice ringing from the kitchen, he put a lock around his gates, and then he drew the bolts across the front door, and he told Nutmeg that she was not to set out foot in Rose Cottage except in a major emergency, such as running out of flour. It's simply too dangerous to venture out while that ill-tempered creature is out there, he said firmly, as they sat down to a lunch of cold tongue and potato salad, followed by a sponge cake. We must hibernate until she's gone. But what about the children? Nutmeg wailed. We can't stop visiting the attic, Tumtum. Imagine how bereft they'd feel. If you feel bereft, you're kind of empty, feeling sad and empty. It's not worth the risk, Nutmeg, Tumtum said. There's something about that woman that makes my spine tingle. Oh, I know, Tumtum. She makes mine tingle too, said Nutmeg replied. But we can't let her make us prisoners in our own home. So long as we wait until she's gone to bed, then it must be safe to move around. A couple of mice have never woken anybody. Tumtum looked thoughtful. It was true that every house mouse has the right to roam freely after dark, and they especially wanted to visit the attic that night because they had a rather wonderful present for the children, a 5-pound note. It's kind of like a $5 bill that they had found shortly before Aunt Ivy arrived, half buried in the snowbank by the lane in front of the cottage. They'd rolled the money into a cylinder. You know, a cylinder is like a long, it's rounded, and the top and the bottom is a circle. So they rolled it up into a cylinder, and then Tumtum had carried it home on his shoulder, and now it was leaning against their kitchen wall, waiting to be delivered. Oh, let's take it tonight, Tumtum, Nutmeg squealed for the dozenth time. Tumtum finished his sponge cake, untucked his napkin from his collar, and sighed. All right, Nutmeg, he said resignedly, we'll go, but he felt very uneasy about it. Do you have a prediction? Do you feel uneasy about it? We have another pause. Much later, after supper, the mice tiptoed up to their front gate and peeked out under the dresser. The kitchen light was still on, and they could see Aunt Ivy's shadow cast across the floor. She was sitting at the table smoking. They went back to Nutmouse Hall, waited an hour, and then crept back to the gate. Oh, Aunt Ivy was still there. Really, Nutmeg thought disapprovingly. No wonder she always looks so crazy if she never goes to bed. Eventually, at a very late hour, they came to the gate to find the kitchen light turned off. They let themselves out and scuttled through to the hall, Tumtum carrying the note again on his shoulder. The living room light was on and the door open, but there was no sign of Aunt Ivy. Tumtum's ears pricked up as he heard water running upstairs. Come on, dear, he said, turning to his wife. She's having a bath. We can sneak up now. They ran up the baseboard and sped across the landing. They could hear Aunt Ivy splashing about in the bathroom, humming tunelessly. The noise made them both shudder. Finally, they clambered up to the attic, and Tumtum climbed onto the dresser and then unrolled the note and left it leaning against the mirror. So the note is like the bill. That's what they call it, like a bill. A $5 bill. Oh, gosh, look at that. Do you see them down there at the bottom? And the sinister shadow, menacing shadow. Nutmeg wanted to do some cleaning, but Tumtum wouldn't let her. He felt growing apprehension. That means you're worried, you're nervous, you sense something. Not tonight, Nutmeg, he said. We must get back to Nutmouse Hall while Aunt Ivy's still wallowing. So they ate the biscuits that the children had laid out for them in the dollhouse, even though neither had much of an appetite. And then they made for home. But as they were galloping across the upstairs landing, Nutmeg tripped on her apron strings and landed on the floor, all four paws in the air. Oof! It was very painful. Tumtum pulled her to her feet. Are you all right, dear? He asked anxiously. Oh, yes, yes, Tumtum, nothing broken, nothing. And then, oh, bother, she said, fumbling in her apron pocket. I've dropped the key to the gate. Oh, bother, bother, bother. Tumtum shone his flashlight around, nervously scouring the carpet. Eventually, Nutmeg saw it glinting behind the leg of the dresser. There it is, she said, squirreling it into her apron pocket. Now hurry, dear, do hurry, Tumtum said, tugging her by the paw. But as he did so, the mice were bathed in a brilliant pool of light. The bathroom door had opened, and looming above them was a tall, thin figure wrapped in a white towel. Okay, that is the end of chapter 4. We'll find out what happens on chapter 5. I'll give you a sneak peek of the next illustration. Yikes. Okay. Do you have apprehension? Yikes.